It's called Spotlight on Carbon Management Projects Under Development. It's great to have four very distinguished speakers, and we're going to try to keep this lively. Obviously, these projects are under development, and as Matt just highlighted, we need a lot more projects. So these are our trailblazers, and we need to keep this trajectory upward. So I'm going to give some brief comments, but after I go, we'll have Cindy Crane, who is the CEO of Enchant Energy. We have Karen Matusic, who is the Senior Director of External Affairs for Equinor, and she focuses on the Appalachian tri-state region. And then we have Dr. Rodney Andrews, who is the Director of the Center for Applied Energy Research and Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of Kentucky. Go Cats. And then we have Matt Hagen, who is the Government Relations Manager and Senior Business Development Manager for Global Carbon Dioxide Solutions at Air Products. So maybe we'll just give a round of applause for our speakers.
Starting off.
That was just
in case it goes horribly wrong.
So, anyway, I'm Matt Bright. I'm the Carbon Capture Policy Manager for the Clean Air Task Force. And right. And so Clean Air Task Force, go back.
That's going to be me.
Pause. There we go. Clean Air Task Force, we were founded in 1996. We are a non-traditional environmental advocacy organization. We have a mission to push the technology and policy changes needed to achieve a zero carbon emissions planet, high energy planet at an affordable cost. So we are interested in the policies and the technologies that are going to get us there in an affordable and socially responsible manner. We actually have over 100 employees now based all over the world, and we have about 13 in DC. I'm based in DC, but our carbon management team has about 15 people on it now, and based in Europe, in the Middle East, as well as in North America. Right, so carbon management, when we're thinking about carbon capture or carbon management, policy undergirds all of it. It's the raison d'etre for carbon capture, why we're all here, right? And so when we think about the timeline of where we've come, where we're going, we're talking about projects under development now. DOE started its carbon capture program in '97. Of course, we know 45Q was birthed in 2008, but it was really born again in 2018. And so we've had we've had Energy Policy Act back in 2005 and 7, big bills. And then 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act, we had the 45Q was put to its present values. But really, if we're thinking about carbon capture, I like to think about our projects as kind of essentially 2018 to now. So we're really thinking about an ecosystem of projects that really isn't that old. So we know that 45Q is $50 for saline storage, $35 for EOR and other utilization. If we're thinking about what's been going on now, we've actually had some really good progress, and so it's good to step back to think about that for a minute. We've had the Bipartisan Budget Act. We had the Energy Act at the end of 2020, which authorized a lot of what was then done in IJA that was appropriated. And now we're thinking about reconciliation. So it's just important that we're in a tense moment where reconciliation might be going forward. We need a lot of these things, but just to think that we've gotten a lot done really in 4 years. And so the projects reflect that. When we think about U.S. carbon capture projects, this is just in the last 4 years since 2018, and actually 2022, we're just about to update this, and those bars will get higher. So we're having projects announced all the time now, which is a really good thing. when we're thinking about it, we have this metric. Actually, the last time we updated this graphic was in January, and it's already out of date. There are 99 U.S. projects that have been announced, and it's a huge percentage upward tick, which is really, really important. So, Clean Air Task Force, we have this nifty map where we keep track of carbon capture projects. I highly encourage you to click on that link when it gets shared with you and check our map out. But some interesting things that we have, if you go up into the upper right corner, click on those three dots, there will be the database, an Excel spreadsheet that's got all of the specific projects on there. So if you're interested in them, you can take a look, see where they are. You can click on the project, get the announcement where it is to see we only put on our map publicly announced projects. And so you can see that information. You can click on any of the areas in gray. Those are carbon dioxide storage areas. You can click on the basin and actually get the name of the carbon dioxide storage basin. So you can learn some geology. It's pretty cool. Right, so again, just click on those dots. You get the spreadsheet right there. Right. So just looping back to policy, we're interested in this reconciliation bill, raising those 45Q values across the board for direct air capture, industrial power generation, EOR. This is the modeling that CATF's done, where we're thinking about what would be the effect of, we've already passed the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. That's great. That's like building a highway. And then raising the values of 45Q is like putting the cars on the highway. And what we find is that when you do raise the 45Q values, we're getting up to 125 million, 130 million tons of dedicated carbon capture and saline storage by 2031, and then even higher, hitting that exponential stride that we need to get to a landing path that we need to achieve by 2050. So that's very important. And where could carbon management be going? This is just, Matt showed a very similar map that GPI did. This is just looking at power generation facilities, that if we passed the reconciliation bill and allowed for more facilities to qualify for 45Q, these are power generation facilities. These are industrial, look at that next one, that's industrial. And then looking at just overlaid over the storage. A lot of potential out here, and delighted to have this panel continue the discussion of where they're going. So we will start off with Cindy Crane.
Good morning. It's great to be with everybody this morning. And I just want to spend a few minutes going through who is Enchant Energy, what are we doing, and frankly, why are we doing what we're doing? Because I think, to me, it's why are we doing it that drives me personally. So I want to make sure that we highlight that. Enchant Energy Corporation is a clean energy company that is providing environmental services that will decarbonize industry and help mitigate climate change. And we're doing that via a carbon capture as a service, a carbon capture and storage as a service model. So think of an industrial facility that needs carbon mitigation. We can come in and we can provide that service rather than the industries themselves having to venture into technologies that are not their forte, things of that nature. So we've chosen to have a capture as a service model. We are currently focused significantly on large-scale decarbonization projects. Our focus around large scale is very purposeful, and it is because we are wanting to be able to make a difference in a big way and where we can contribute. But we also want to focus mostly in rural America and mostly around power facilities, because we believe there's a significant need for that, and it can provide significant benefit to those communities, and preserve jobs, preserve tax base, and also create jobs and tax base. So that is a huge driving force for Enchant. And we're also focused on proven technologies that have been deployed, are commercial, and have proven that they can capture at a 95% or greater level. And we believe that by doing that, it really enables the host sites to play a major role in mitigation of carbon emissions and help to advance other industry in their regions and areas. So from a graphical standpoint, obviously this map looks familiar. We are really focused in the mountain and the Midwest region of the United States initially. We're looking for facilities that have significant scale. We're looking for facilities that have all of their other environmental emission controls abated, and with the exception of carbon and our ability to come in and address the carbon. We're also looking for facilities that have oversized existing infrastructure that can be utilized, as well as has proximity to CO2 storage, and also to geologic formations. So from a structure standpoint, we are a developer. And so if you look at the top bubble up there with the dotted line, that's Enchant Energy Corporation. And we are building at the corporate level a development pipeline. Our first project is the project I'll speak about today. That is the San Juan Generating Station in San Juan County, which is the northwestern corner of New Mexico. And we are in the FEED study process and about to wrap the FEED study up and move to the next level there. We have secured a second project that we have underway with a pre-feasibility assessment, which is the same preliminary step we took with San Juan Generating Station. And we are positioned to respond to an RFP that will be coming out shortly with regards to a third facility opportunity. And we just entered into an NDA with some parties regarding another opportunity. And so San Juan's a little unique from our service model because the opportunity came to us as a generation ownership opportunity. So it is a power plant, and we are going to acquire 95% of the ownership in that facility, and then we are going to come in and install the carbon capture equipment and decarbonize the facility. So from that standpoint, we really have two lines of business, legal entities that will pertain to San Juan. The one on the left side of your screen is what you can basically refer to as the capture company, the Capture Co. And that would be the capture as a service model. The other two really are very specific to San Juan and pertain to the generation plant ownership, and then the operations of the facility and the marketing of the offtake at the facility. We are also very focused as a company on ESG, and that comes part and parcel to the scope of our targets for prospects. We want to target decarbonization that's located in rural communities across the United States, primarily in the West and the Midwest right now. Many of these facilities are also located near or on tribal sovereign lands. And we believe that decarbonizing these facilities are critical for improving the economic, social, and environmental lives of rural and low-income communities. We also believe by improving the air quality and the standards of living through the decarbonization of these facilities at large scale, that it will achieve significant environmental benefits, and we have targeted the 95% or greater reduction. but it also comes with additional environmental benefits. At our San Juan project, here at the tail end of our FEED study, our data indicates that we will also reduce upwards of 50% additional reduction of SO2 and SO3. So very important as we look at all aspects on the environmental spectrum. And then clearly jobs, jobs, jobs. By decarbonizing these existing facilities, we will be preserving thousands of jobs and adding additional high-paying and primarily union jobs in rural America that would otherwise be lost. And this will result in maintaining and growing the middle class across rural America and also in our tribal communities. Also on the ESG side, we focus pretty extensively on diversity. We have diversity in our management, we have diversity in our board. Currently, our newest investor in Enchant is the Navajo Transitional Energy Company. They are going to play a significant role in our success and help us be able to broaden our decarbonization success to other facilities and other communities, and hopefully also other tribes and their employees and citizens of their communities. We also deploy diversity in everything we do from an employment standpoint, whether it's our workforce but also the partners that we choose. It's important that they have the same values that we have and that they value diversity, and we also apply that criteria to contractors that we engage for specific pieces of work. Specifically for San Juan, we are partnering very closely with our tribal communities and focused on clean water and providing fresh and clean water availability at a greater level in order to broaden that across the nation, for the Navajo Nation specifically with that project. But we're also focused on being a good community partner in every sense of the word. Day one, when we engaged with the San Juan project, we engaged with the San Juan Community College. We entered into an MOU, and we are now advancing our work with the college on jobs training. So the San Juan Community College has a School of Energy. It is a vocational training school, and it's about training the skills for the jobs of the future. And we want to make sure that they have what they need to be able to train the workforce, not only the future workforce for the continuation of the power plant, the coal mine, and the other industrial facilities in the area, but also for the carbon capture technologies and the storage and sequestration. So why San Juan Generating Station? For me, whoa, no, I didn't do that. For me, it was very important when I stepped into this opportunity. I looked at various different aspects. And why San Juan was one of the things that I looked at very closely. And so the answer to the question why is because it's got scale. And we all know that economics comes with scale in almost any dimension that you look at it. San Juan is a 914 gross megawatt coal-fired electric generation facility. It also has a secure fuel supply, which is located literally across the parking lot with the underground mining operations of San Juan Mine that is owned and operated by Westmoreland Mining Holdings. And it also is a low emissions facility today for all of its emissions with the exception of carbon. The prior owners have invested all of the emission control in the facility. And it also important to me is that San Juan is a zero discharge facility. So as we look at all the environmental attributes of these projects, these things are very critical and important. San Juan has also got great storage proximity. And I looked at this from a risk management standpoint, which is it's near the Cortez pipeline, which is the CO2 pipeline that provides enhanced oil recovery CO2 access to the Permian Basin. but it's also located on the San Juan Basin geologic formation. So it's got a tooth prong, as I like to put it, storage strategy and opportunity to where we can connect and go EOR or go divert the CO2 over for direct geologic sequestration. And when you're dealing with projects that have the number, the letter B for billion of an investment, you really start to look at all the risk diversification aspects that you can. And then clearly this is an electric generating power station, and so having regional access for being able to get the power out, move the power around was important. And you can see by this graphic, this map, that is the western grid, power grid in red. It's not our heart mains or anything, it is actually our power grid at high voltage. And the blue circle is the location of San Juan. It is literally located in the heart of the southwestern transmission grid. And you have the ability to move that low emission, reliable economic power anywhere in the western United States. So from a carbon capture as a service model perspective, I drew a line. This is our schematic for our project. It really simplifies it. But I drew a dotted line down the middle for the purpose of today's discussion, because everything on the right-hand side is the service that we're going to be providing to that industrial facility. It's the installation and the operation of the capture facilities, it's the transportation of the CO2, and it's the direct geologic and or offtake for EOR. That's the service model. We happen to be also acquiring the power plant, so we do have the other side of it. And I think what's very unique, I ran a utility before I retired. This is my retirement gig. And I'll define retirement for you in a minute, because it's not what you think. But what's different as a CEO of a very large utility with an extremely large coal fleet, right? We always looked at carbon capture as, oh my goodness sakes, that is a massive parasitic load, right? And we're already using all of those megawatt hours to service our rate-paying customers. You know, it's a takeaway. Not only is it a takeaway from our customers, it's a cost to our customers, because we got to spend $1 billion plus to actually build that next piece of emissions control equipment. Carbon capture and storage as a service is a different model. We come to our host sites and we come as a customer. We will be their biggest customer, single customer. We will pay them, so we will buy, we will have a contract, and we will purchase our electricity that we need. We will purchase our steam that we require. We will purchase our water that we need for the processing, and we will buy their flue gas from them, and we will decarbonize it for them. So in the circumstances it pertains to San Juan Generating Station at its scale, that customer is upwards of a 300 megawatt plus equivalent customer. So they're not losing power, they're actually gaining a base load anchor tenant customer. And that's a big difference through the lens of a generally regulated utility. So that is what we have to offer, and we think that is what makes this more feasible for utilities to engage into advanced carbon capture. Why San Juan? It preserves in excess of 1,500 direct and indirect jobs, as well as more than $53 million in annual tax revenues for the benefit of the county and the cities around it. This was a New Mexico independent assessment done. These are not Enchant's numbers. And I would also encourage you, our website, enchantenergy.com, also has another study out there that was commissioned by the Department of Energy. It was not commissioned by us. In fact, we were not even aware of it until they were ready to publish it. And I think what you'll see is their numbers are even significantly higher on the broader regional look that they've done than our numbers here. So we've tried to go with the conservative local number. It assures that there will be a reliable, low emissions electricity source for the Western US. I don't know what you guys are reading, but there's a whole lot of worry about summer coming. And it isn't just California, and it isn't just Texas. It's across the West. It's in the MISO region. As a country, we need to make sure we have stable, reliable electricity. It drives our economy. So if we think about it in a post-decarbonization window, once we decarbonize San Juan Generating Station, its CO2 intensity will be well below 250 pounds per megawatt hour. For relative comparison, a natural gas power generation station is between 900 and 1100 megawatts or pounds per megawatt hour. So once decarbonized, we are this close to being able to take that facility to carbon neutral, and maybe we add a direct air capture, a small direct air capture or something, and that facility can become carbon neutral. It's also because it not only preserves jobs, but it creates significant construction jobs. Many of those jobs also are the trade jobs, the union trades, very high paying jobs in excess of 2 million worker hours just for the capture facilities itself. And then we will be, by the investment level, we will add approximately 1.6 billion in additional tax base to a very underserved part of New Mexico. It will maintain the middle class for the tribal communities, especially for the Navajo Nation, who our workforce is between 40 to 60% Navajo. And it will provide for generational opportunities for those families, just as it has done since those facilities were built. So where are we? We are this close to putting the bow on the FEED study. We'll have the capital cost updated from Kiewit by the end of this week. Sergeant Lundy is working on the updated operating costs. So we had a pre-feasibility, now we've got the detailed FEED study that those will be generated from. And then we will file our FEED package per our milestone dates with the Department of Energy by June 30th. And that, for all intended purposes, brings a close to the FEED study. Obviously, our partnership with the Department of Energy, we have a 90-day period where we'll go back and forth on the details of the FEED study, and then we'll finalize it on September 30th. We've already initiated the discussions for the air permit modification to add the carbon capture emission control to the facility. We're finalizing the plant ownership acquisition terms, and we're advancing our connector pipeline. We are working with New Mexico Tech on a Carbon Safe Phase 3 program where they have completed their geologic modeling of the San Juan Basin Formation. They are targeting the Entrada as the injection zone, and they are preparing to drill a stratigraphic test well, and we are looking to finalize the location of the injection wells so that we can move to the next step, which is to file the EPA Class 6 injection well permits. So, coming full circle, personally, I retired from Pacificor at the end of 2018 for all intended purposes. And I like to play golf. I'm a person that works hard and plays hard, so I love the outdoors. I was having a great time in retirement. 18 months into retirement, 2 New York investors approached me and asked me if I would lead Enchant Energy Corporation for this San Juan project. And I looked at it very closely because my definition of retirement was I want to stay engaged, I want to be able to use my expertise and my knowledge, and I want to give back and I want to make a difference. And when I looked at this opportunity and the opportunities that can spin and expand from this, I couldn't think of a better way to use the expertise that I gained over 30 years in the industry and to give back and make a difference by decarbonizing and helping these communities. So for me, it's personal, and which is why I'm here. And then lastly, we can't do it without partners. I mean, Chance is a very small little company, we're a startup. I looked at this and said, the smartest thing they did was bring the best partners they could to the table. And then that was when they brought Mitsubishi for the technology, Sargent Lundy for the engineering, and Kiewit Power for the construction. These three parties are the ones that built and implemented the Petronova, which proved the technology at commercial scale. And then we've added to that partnership, I've already highlighted a few of them on there, but also added Kohn-Resnick. If you don't know who Kohn-Resnick is, they are the leading but boutique tax equity structuring and financing business in the country, and just fabulous to work with. So with that, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Cindy. Fascinating. Next up, we have Karen Matusic with Equinor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with so many experts in the carbon management field. And I'd like to invoke what Matt said earlier about being nice. I'm perhaps the least technically adept person in this room, so remember that when you're asking questions and answers during the period later. Who is Equinor? Equinor is a leading oil and gas, I would say global energy company. In fact, you might have known it originally as Statoil. It was the Norwegian state oil company. Has operations in many countries, obviously Norway, offshore Norway, but we're operating in many countries, including the US. We're offshore Gulf of Mexico, and here in the Appalachian Basin, where we have shale development in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. We are also, like many big integrated oil and gas companies, committed to all forms of energy to meet growing energy demand. I think one of the speakers said earlier that we're going to need all forms of energy to meet this global demand, and we firmly believe that. For example, we're the largest floating offshore wind operator in the world. We're about to do a project in New York, and I never thought an oil and gas company would be welcome in New York, but we are for offshore wind. Equinor is also taking a leading role to lead the world to a net zero carbon future. And we've pledged by 2013 to reduce our emissions associated with our own produced oil and gas by 50% compared to 2015 levels. And in fact, a lot of our investment going forward, majority is going towards low carbon solutions and renewables versus oil and gas. We believe hydrogen has a big role to play on the road to this decarbonization. And here in the Appalachian Basin, it cannot be done without carbon capture and sequestration. It's integral to decarbonization. As a company, we have a goal to be a player in 3 to 5 low carbon hubs around the world. And in Europe, we're already active in Norway, the UK, and Germany with these decarbonization efforts that usually involve hydrogen and carbon capture. Carbon capture and hydrogen operations are not new to Equinor. In fact, we have operated carbon capture since 1996 at our offshore gas operations in the Norwegian North Sea. And we've been a hydrogen producer and consumer for years. So here, Equinor's experience, as I said, with carbon capture began in the 1990s. You know, we were incentivized. The Norwegian government back in 1991 put a tax on carbon, which obviously incentivized a lot of the carbon capture development. We have, since 1996, the Sleipner field, which was the first industrial scale carbon capture and storage purely for carbon capture, for carbon abatement in the world. The carbon was removed from produced gas offshore and pumped back into the ground while the gas is piped ashore. Then the Snøhvit project, which stands for Snow White in Norwegian. It's an offshore gas field. The natural gas containing carbon is piped to a processing facility where the carbon is separated using amine capture, and the carbon is piped back to the field for injection. And then finally, the Longship project. This is the first ever cross-border, open-source carbon capture and transport and storage network in the world. Through the Northern Lights, which is a joint venture between Equinor, Shell, and Total, we're developing the infrastructure to transport carbon from industrial emitters by ship. So we're currently building 2 dedicated CO2 carriers in a shipyard in China. We're ready in mid-2024 to take the carbon from emitters by ship to a receiving terminal in Western Norway for intermediate storage before being transported by pipeline for permanent storage in a geological reservoir 2 to 3 kilometers below the seabed. Operations are scheduled to begin 2024 with an initial injection of 1.4 million tons of carbon into the hydrostatic reservoir. A little bit too fast on the trigger. For a variety of reasons, Equinor has set its sights on the Appalachian Basin to lead an effort for federal funding of a hydrogen and carbon capture hub. The region is the ideal place for a hydrogen hub. It has the natural gas supply. If the Marcellus and Utica Shale was a standalone country, it would be the 3rd largest gas field in the world. So a lot of available, affordable natural gas. The geology, the access to infrastructure with our river system, the potential for barging, the existing pipeline system. Perhaps we could use some existing corridors to install pipeline. Proximity to heavy industry. There are more than 70 facilities emitting a total of close to 120 million tons a year of carbon. So we have your steel mills, your concrete, your heavy industry, your cement companies, so the heavy emitters that we're working with. We have the educational vocational institutions, a labor force that's used to extractive industries and heavy industries, and a deep history of extractive industries. This is home to many of the largest emitters, as I said. But the region doesn't come without its challenges. It's not maybe the easiest place to put carbon capture and sequestration facilities. We're currently planning, as Equinor, to drill test wells in the region this year to determine viability and scalability. As I said, with those many emitters, you're going to have a large space to sequester carbon. As much of the acreage in the region is in private hands, we will need early engagement with landowners once we determine who controls the pore space. And in these 3 states, there aren't really existing laws or regulations on that. You know, right now with shale, obviously the mineral owners have the rights. But you know, we think in the case of carbon capture, it probably makes sense for the surface owners to control the pore space. So we're hoping also that states seek primacy for Class 6 wells, as the permit process we think will probably be a little bit more streamlined than a federal process. We have West Virginia right now that's currently seeking primacy, but we have good reason to believe Ohio and Pennsylvania will follow suit. I know that a lot of these topics are going to be subject of discussion later today, so look forward to that. To eliminate much of the risk associated with legacy wellbore issues. So not many people, especially in Texas where I lived, realize that Ohio and Pennsylvania probably were producing oil well before Texas was. So there's a lot of legacy wells there, conventional wells, in addition to shale wells. So we have to be very careful with those risks because we may penetrate potential injection zones. So at first we'll primarily be targeting the deep saline aquifers. But we also may find areas with few legacy wells or newer wells where we know how they were completed and that they had robust construction and they might not pose as much risk. So there is potential to have something in those shallower intervals. The basin also has numerous sealing units which provide assurance of containment of the carbon. These are evident in the extensive shales which overlay much of the basin and also the impermeable salt layer which overlies a large part of the basin. So it is quite viable that we will find primary and secondary sealing units. For Equinor, proper development will involve an appraisal program, a quite extensive appraisal program with extensive data acquisition to evaluate the geomechanical properties of the reservoirs. This combined with proven operating practices for injection, and that includes injection pressure monitoring constantly relative to geomechanical analysis, and surveillance and monitoring for well logging to identify saturation and location of CO2, including monitoring the wells. And for us, this will be a prudent and proven operating plan. There are both tight and higher permeability rocks in the region, in the basin. Our primary goal is to find the better quality reservoirs for injection, provided they meet the other criteria, which is suitable geomechanics, the storage capacity, and location. However, given the good sealing units in the basin, a potential solution is to also combine some of these stacked reservoirs, enabling injection into more than one reservoir of stacked storage units. And this is something that we're used to in the industry, and oil and gas reservoirs routinely are commingled this way. As I noted earlier, carbon capture and sequestration really is new to the region. I remember when there was a lot of concern about Class 2 wells, which is the brine disposal wells, and a lot of things that weren't true were circulated in the media and amongst folks that were opposed to shale. So we have a lot of work ahead to educate all stakeholders about safe and responsible operations and the many benefits that carbon capture represents as a low carbon solution. I grew up in the Appalachian region, I think third generation coal family, and as our previous speaker talked about, we really have to work with these communities. It's not good to just say we're just going to shut down everything. I think in many ways this is going to provide a big market for the natural gas because there's going to be a lot of demand. We hope for hydrogen there, and the best way to make that right now is with natural gas. And also it's going to enable us to really help those heavy emitters stay in business and to manage their carbon better. We need a workable regulatory framework for siting, construction, operation, and safety of carbon capture infrastructure. Right now, there isn't really much laws on the books because this is so new here. We need clearly defined ownership of pore space and permitting of Class 6 wells. In West Virginia, they recently passed a law, and I think you have to get 65 or 70% of the approval of all landowners in a particular area. And as you know, with pore space on carbon capture, it could be vast. We could be talking about, I live in West Virginia, we could talk about thousands of landowners to try to get permission to put a sequestration facility there. We need simple, cost-effective access to land for storage. This isn't going to be like shale. There's not going to be big signing bonuses and royalties. Really, we're storing something under there. We're not taking anything out. And we need the efficient regulatory process and sequestration rules. There's going to be a vast amount, if the way we envision it at Equinor and other companies, of how we can set up these hydrogen hubs, you're going to need a vast amount of infrastructure, whether it's pipelines to be taking the carbon out, to get the carbon from emitters. I mean, ideally, we'll be able to put these facilities near the power plants and the steel mills that are working, but it might not be possible, depending on what we find in the geology. So we're going to need really rigorous but transparent and fact-based, science-based regulatory regime. We're going to need regular and transparent dialogue with all stakeholders. That's paramount to our success. This is truly groundbreaking, what we're seeing, what we're asking here. This is like a moonshot or the internet or NASA. It's going to require a true public-private community partnership, like Cindy was talking about in Kenya earlier. Companies like Equinor, we have done this before. We've done this in the UK, we've done this in Norway, countries that I think, in terms of net zero, are far ahead of where we are in the US, and it's worked. But we need to all join together, and as such, we're very excited to work with partners in the region, partners in the communities, partners in the regulatory, with the policymakers to make this vision a reality here. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And next we have Dr. Rodney Andrews from University of Kentucky.
Thanks. Thanks for the chance to talk to you all today. I'm just going to go through kind of a broad sweep of the projects going on at the University of Kentucky that touch directly or indirectly on carbon management. If you're not familiar with it, UK is a Research One university. It's the flagship for the state of Kentucky. We did over $485 million in research last year. And energy is one of the 7 focal areas for the university and its research programs. We've been working in carbon capture for a long time, particularly looking at trying to match the capture process, whether that's process design or chemistry, to the source that we're trying to capture off of. A lot of work has been on process intensification to bring both capital and operating costs down. Looking also for chemical capture, looking at how do we reduce solvent costs, and that being one of the primary operating expenses. Trying to make it simpler, also doing heat integration to reduce the parasitic load. And then also doing, looking at minimizing the secondary environmental aspects. We don't want to swap one problem for another. And a lot of this work, as it's gone up in scale into small and then larger demonstrations, is really to de-risk a lot of these technologies and to make them more suitable for industrial acceptance. We started this work in 2008. It was a combination of, at that time it was E.ON, LG&E KU's parent company then, seeding a project at the Center for Applied Energy Research, at the same time as the Commonwealth of Kentucky deciding, as dependent as it was on coal, it wanted to understand carbon capture and carbon sequestration. And this is just a slide for the carbon capture. You can see how we've steadily scaled up. I'll talk a little bit about the 3 ton per day plant that is where we're at now, but we've also gone ahead with feed studies on much larger plants. These are just a selection of projects that are specifically on carbon capture. This is on post-combustion CO2 capture with increased mass transfer. The bit in the middle there are 3D printed polymer hybrid packing for the absorber columns. Those allow the column to be about 30% shorter. Is there a pointer on this?
Yeah.
Aha, right there. It allows the column to be about 30% shorter. You can see that it improves capture. And a big part is it also reduces fugitive emissions of nitrosamine, which is the primary environmental concern with chemical capture. And this is work, these projects are work that's led by Professor Kunli Liu, as well as Heather Nikolic, who's at the Center for Applied Energy Research. Here they're looking at using a fogging and a frothing section within the absorber columns. This has been demonstrated fairly effectively. It's run for over 2,000 hours. It does improve absorption by volume between 2.5 and 4 times over a traditionally packed column. And again, that's going to reduce capital and operating expense for a capture unit. Also looking at what do we do with the CO2 once you catch it. We've gotten pretty good at catching it. It's more this one that's the big question out there. This is a project led by Jesse Thompson at the Energy Center. And there he's looking at electrochemical processes, electrocatalytic processes, where he can convert CO2 directly into formic acid. Formic acid is going to be a lot easier to store and or market as a product. There's Heather. You miss me slaughtering your projects. All right, come on. All right, this is another project looking at direct air capture. In here we're looking at electrochemical regeneration of the direct air capture solvent, but a key component of this is that coming off of this, you actually can produce hydrogen during this capture process. That's important as you cycle it back in on the other side of the electrochemical cell, but it also gives you a valuable product that you can come off as you're doing CO2 capture. And direct air capture, that's one of the biggest issues with it, is you're essentially operating a plant to trip CO2 from the air. It doesn't have a lot of other value proposition, and so this is one way to address that. And this is the sort of the new big project. This is taking the plant that we had, the pilot plant that we've operated at KU's Brown Power Station for about the last decade, and it is going to be moved to Nucor for their steel plant to look at doing capture there. This is quite a shift from what you do on a power plant in that it has very low CO2 concentrations in its effluent gas. It's only about 1.5 volume percent rather than 14. But it does allow for a simplified process, but it has to have a lot of modifications to that process. You can't just going to pack it up and plug it back in. You have to look at how do you control matching mass transfer, looking at new adsorber designs and packing, which is a big thing, and also looking at how do you control the load. But when you're looking at this, this should deliver 5% more CO2 captured than the base case from the US DOE, and at 37% reduction in cost. So it's quite a step forward compared to where we're at. And then this is a dual loop solution-based CCS. And this is promising in that it may allow net negative emissions at much lower costs. Here, there's a lot of work that's been done in looking at combining technologies using a primary capture loop, the traditional amine type loop, to capture about 85%, and then capturing the additional in a polishing step using a KOH solvent. And then you can get a hydrogen and oxygen product stream out of this as well. And here we can get 10% more CO2 captured than the base case and do that at 40% less cost. All right. This thing's really finicky. This is a project that's actually a combination between our power generation group and our biofuels program. When Len Peters was Secretary of the Energy Environment Cabinet in Kentucky, he came to us and said, I want to know more about algae. So between the state and the university, we developed one of the larger programs in the country looking at algal capture for CO2. And along with that went, okay, if we're going to be using algae to capture CO2, we're also going to be the largest producer of algae in the country. So what else can we do with it? This project, they're looking at an ammonium loop with a membrane absorber to capture CO2, and then they're taking it and feeding it to an algae field, and I'll show some of that on the next slide. This really reduces the cost of the CO2 capture. It boosts the algal production, which you'll see why we want to do that, and it really is a combination between CO2 capture and CO2 utilization. One of the more novel things is if you're going to have a huge array of algae growing, you also have access to put in solar thermal units to do solvent regeneration, and it allows us to use the ammonia for the capture, but it completely takes care of the ammonia slip issue that you might otherwise have. And so this is just a schematic of it. Really what we're taking is here, your traditional generation unit. We're adding this ammonia loop here, and then as it's rich, it goes over to these regeneration units, takes the CO2 and puts it into the algal field and integrates this thermally and within the system. We also, DOE always wants to know how does this compare to what else has been done. We've looked at this. This ammonia system gives you about 10 times the CO2 utilization in open ponds compared to the more traditional sodium nitrate. We can produce up to 8.7 grams per meter squared per day of algae. That's actually quite a high number for these sorts of systems. And the nice thing is over the years we've developed strains of algae that are quite pH tolerant, so they're quite happy here. One of the things you can see is up here, these are the nice deep green color where we're using the ammonia. And down here, there's two horrifically looking brown ones where the algae culture actually crashed, meaning it did not get enough nutrients from the more standard system and decided to shut down. One of the reasons we're looking at this for utilization is, as I said, our biofuels group. They've done a lot of work over the last decade in developing new methods of converting natural oils into fuels and chemicals. In here, particularly, we focused on decarboxylation and decarbonylation, allowing us to produce drop-in hydrocarbon fuels from algal oils and other natural oils. We've done a lot of focus there on diesel and jet, but the shift is really now towards the sustainable aviation fuel. And the demands for that as the aviation industry and shipping and transport look to move to more carbon neutral places. And what you can see, this is for diesel, but you can see we get quite high conversions and selectivity from those processes. Along with that, this is a bit of a side note, but we also have in our Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering department, they've worked a lot with us in the algae program. They also are doing work in sustainable aviation fuel. And here they're addressing the issue of sulfur being present in those fuels as part of a large collaborative program. Also, in the carbon management area, one of them is avoiding carbon make. We talk about putting capture on cement plants. One of the other options is just make cements that have less CO2 in the entire process. So we've worked, this is Bob Jewell and his group at the Center for Applied Energy Research, working with ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, on basically taking concrete chemistries that are not traditionally used and using them to replace Portland cement. In this case, it's a B-Lite cement. I will not try to explain what that is. But basically compared to, did I just get you in the eye?
No, you're good.
Compared to a traditional Portland cement where you might make 1,600 pounds of CO2 per ton, we can get this down as a net to about 360 to 620. That's a direct CO2 reduction of 60%, and overall the avoided potential is about 40%. These cements, the reason they work the way they do is we've switched that chemistry away from baking limestone and pulverizing to make Portland to making a B-Lite and Yalamite combination that fires at a much lower temperature, and then as it carbonates also can fix some of the CO2. This is work from the Kentucky Geologic Survey. I know Dave Harris is in the back. They're very active in the Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative, where they're looking at, as a large consortium, addressing some of the technical challenges, collecting the data for where suitable areas for CCUS, and looking at regional infrastructure planning, which obviously is very important, has been talked about already in terms of sequestration or transport. This is the Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative. This was originally 3 different groups that have been then brought together to try to get a bit of a more larger regional approach to what we're doing. Kentucky was originally in the blue and the red there. These are, as I mentioned, in 2007, 2008, the Commonwealth decided it wanted to know more about what we could do. And so they funded the Geologic Survey to look at what Kentucky's sequestration potential was, as well as what its EOR and EGR capacity was. So they carried out deep test wells for permanent storage in the western and eastern coal fields. They also looked at enhanced gas recovery and enhanced oil recovery projects in the western field and in the eastern gas fields. What they found is that we actually do have storage capacity within Kentucky. There are different zones and seals that are in different parts of the state. It's not going to work everywhere. That gets into the transmission infrastructure that's needed. The enhanced oil recovery has some issues, primarily economic but also technical, primarily due to the shallow depths, as well as many of our fields are very quite old. Gas recovery in shale has a lot of potential. More research is needed. That's an area that we're also working at the Energy Center, where we're looking at developing novel propants that can be reused to reinvigorate wells. Another area in terms of, this is not carbon, but this is in greenhouse gas emissions, is the work that Geologic Survey is doing for looking at methane emissions. Kentucky has about 14,000 known orphaned wells, and some of them are releasing methane, which is about 24 times in terms of its strength as a greenhouse gas. So we're looking at what can be done with those. KGS is using quite novel technology in terms of being at both aerial and ground measurement. And then, since Ken, you put me on the spot by saying I would talk about this, I will do this without slides, which are some of the other programs that we have going at the university that are looking at addressing some of the key issues both in coal communities as well as within the renewable energy industry. And that's the work we're doing with critical minerals, rare earth elements, and carbon products. The UK group is probably the biggest in the country in terms of coal to carbon products. We work in everything from pitch and coke for making primary steel and aluminum to aerospace carbon fiber, carbon nanomaterials, and other electrochemical storage materials. Probably the one that gets the most press right now is working in critical minerals. The U.S. is completely dependent, 85% on imports for our rare earth elements and many of our critical minerals, including lithium, nickel, and cobalt. And so we are looking at how can we produce those domestically, primarily from the resources in the Illinois and in the mid-Appalachian Basin, where we're looking at using coal from impoundments, middlings, as well as ash as resources to produce many of the rare earth that are required for permanent magnets for a lot of electronics. That really impacts the wind industry as well as dopants for the silicon industry. So those are some of the other projects we're working on that are, tangentially related to how do we reduce carbon emissions. Thank you. Have fun.
Great. And to wrap up, we have yet another Matt, this one, Matt Hagen.
Thank you. Assuming you're also a child of the 80s, so when you go last, you don't want to make a mistake with the pointer after everyone else went first for you. So I'm Matt Hagen, business development, government relations for Air Products. Maybe just a little bit of an overview about what Air Products is currently. We are a US-based industrial gas company. Headquarters is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. While hydrogen may be having a moment right now, we've been in the hydrogen business for about 60 years. So originally came up as kind of an on-site industrial gas producer, but hydrogen and the way that the hydrogen economy develops is really important to us from a safety standpoint, from a carbon intensity standpoint. All of that needs to be very transparent and very open about it as we're kind of coming into like a new era where we can really look at getting hydrogen into kind of some hard to decarbonize industries. So we are a global company, but really we consider ourselves a US-based industrial gas and energy company. At Air Products, we really do feel that sustainability is, one of the core pillars of us as we grow. We are very public about the fact that we're going to be reducing our carbon intensity of our operations by 30% by the end of the decade. And the reason that we say carbon intensity is we are growing, so we're making more hydrogen, we're putting more product into the market, but that alone isn't enough. So it's not enough to be coming forward with some of these projects that we're going to be discussing today, in which we're doing 95% carbon capture on large industrial facilities that also are bringing 200 full-time jobs, things like that. We need to decarbonize our existing assets and infrastructure. So it's not just about a total carbon reduction for us. It's we're doing it on a intensity basis for something that's very transparent, and just to show that we are actually committed to moving forward in that direction. Hydrogen in general also is very integral to the refining industry. It's a way that low sulfur fuels really have progressed. That's where some of these numbers are around, like the 72 million tons of CO2 equivalent avoided. It's getting hydrogen to decarbonize diesel fuels, gasoline. That's the historic business model, and then I'm going to talk about sort of where we're going in the future. So for Air Products, we're very public about our growth pillars. And so the way that we look at that would be gasification. We've been acquiring and developing gasification technology now in the last couple of years. And gasification for us is a way to unlock distressed feedstocks. Typically, feed to gasification is considered a waste from other processes. There's a way that we can actually get energy out of that. We can capture the CO2 more effectively, obviously, with our carbon capture platform. Very important as we grow further in the energy industry. Carbon capture, which we'll talk about here much more, and everyone in the room is very aware. Air Products was the first to actually work with the Department of Energy back in 2012, 2013, to retrofit an existing steam methane reforming asset. We did it at our Port Arthur plant in Texas. That was a steam methane on an industrial scale, consistently supplying hydrogen to a refinery where we capture all the processed CO2 emissions there. So that facility is about 60% decarbonized, and I've got a slide on that coming up. Hydrogen for mobility. This slide is quickly becoming outdated as the hydrogen economy changes by the minute, or whatever you want to say for hubs and in general, right? hydrogen for mobility for us is really kind of putting hydrogen into new markets. So specifically, Class 8 trucking, a lot of marine transport through the way of utilizing ammonia. I'll talk about ammonia as well. Ammonia typically can be a hydrogen carrier, but it also is a fuel of the future. All three of these platforms are huge business drivers for us as we move forward. So specifically to carbon capture, the picture here you're seeing is on our large industrial steam methane reformer. This is what we worked with the Department of Energy back in 2012, 2013. We were able to successfully retrofit this unit while it was fully in operation, and it has not come offline once to date. So here we are 9 years later. We're capturing 1 million tons a year of CO2 on that asset. That is also a VSA technology, so it's an absorbent technology. Air Products' view is that as we are doing things like, as everyone on the panel has talked about, potentially increasing the parasitic load for carbon capture, actually using electricity. But when we look at the industry going forward, we're optimistic about how the carbon intensity of electricity is going to drop. We're very interested in our carbon capture solutions being associated with adsorbent technology, vacuum swing absorption for that fact. If you want to think about how much 1 million tons a year of CO2 is that you're actually capturing across these 9 years, it's about 1.5 million passenger vehicle equivalents for that 9 million tons a year that we've successfully captured from that facility to date. And that was what we consider the baseline now for commercial capture. Since we're 9 years into it, a steam methane reforming asset, you can capture the process emissions and have a 60% lower carbon intensity on industrial scale hydrogen production today. So I'm going to get into some of our project announcements that we've had in the last year at Air Products. So this is, obviously it's not the US, but it's important up in Alberta, Canada. What we did last year is we announced actually a net zero hydrogen production facility, and we consider this a project basically a really good roadmap for the hydrogen economy, but it's a real hydrogen ecosystem. The facility will be taking natural gas, and the process is called autothermal reforming. Typically in the hydrogen industry to date, it's always been steam methane reforming, but if you're actually going to be trying to capture the CO2 emissions and actually look at how like a carbon conscious world is developing at industrial scale utilizing natural gas, you do a different technology. And the reason for that is the CO2 emissions aren't coming out of like a dilute stack at like atmospheric pressure. These CO2 emissions, because the reactions are happening at a higher pressure, you can have them concentrated and then you can actually separate them easier. This facility in Alberta is 95% capture. So if you look at just the facility gate from the natural gas in, the hydrogen production out, we're capturing 95% of the CO2 emissions there. What also we're doing here, though, that is interesting is, we're actually going to be taking our hydrogen product and we're going to be powering the facility. So there's going to be a hydrogen power plant on site. That is important for us to demonstrate that it is possible at industrial scale to actually commercialize and utilize hydrogen power applications as a really nice kind of like roadmap for everyone going forward. The back end of our facility here, we have a hydrogen production network across Alberta. It's in the industrial heartland. For anyone that's familiar with the area, that's where we will be ended up sending our low carbon hydrogen to existing infrastructure users. And we also have the ability to make liquid hydrogen product out of the plant. Air Products views liquid hydrogen as a great way to get hydrogen into some of these emerging industries that are looking to figure out how to decarbonize themselves. And we feel like around like a 500-mile radius, you can economically get this hydrogen from Alberta specifically into new markets. Just a few more plants on the facility. This facility has passed final investment decision, so our board of directors has approved it. It's coming in around $1.3 billion Canadian, so we'll say 1.5. I didn't check the conversion to date, and going to be on stream here in the next 2.5 years. Really important that this is not just an announcement for us, like an MOU, an LOI. This is actually going to be into production here inside of 2 years. We're fully into execution there. For the US, we had a very big announcement last year with the state of Louisiana, our partners in the room, and I'm sure everyone knows who Jason is. He sits in the corner. He's not very quiet. But what we did really as a company was we looked across our entire hydrogen pipeline across our Gulf Coast network. What this red line is it's the largest hydrogen production network in the world. It's a hydrogen pipeline going from New Orleans all the way into LaPorte, Texas. So it's 700 miles. We have 25 production assets there. Whenever we wanted to do a full-scale blue hydrogen production facility, so whereas in the Alberta project that we announced earlier, that's with like a consortium on the back end to actually transport the CO2 and sequester it in Alberta. What we're doing in Louisiana is the full scope. So Air Products is actually doing the carbon capture, we're doing the sequestration, the transport, and then we're actually operating the carbon capture facility in Ascension Parish in Louisiana. Whenever we looked to figure out where to place this facility, it was important for us to have blue hydrogen, low carbon, clean hydrogen, co-located inside of an area that is hard to decarbonize. So we ended up picking the industrial corridor along the Mississippi River in Louisiana because there's cement, there's steel, there's existing refining infrastructure, and we can also co-locate the carbon sequestration site. We didn't want to get into a business where we have a long transport network of CO2 pipelines. You know, this is something that is very economical to capture on the back end and sequester. So fortunate that we were able to work with the state of Louisiana through the process to actually get the pore space to access the site that will be world scale. The blue hydrogen facility in Louisiana, we're going to be sequestering over 5 million tons a year of CO2. So whereas sites that are in operation today are around the 1 million ton per year. Our facility in Port Arthur, Texas also, that's the 1 million ton per year of carbon capture. This will be 5 million. Really important to us because not only are we going to be doing a 95% capture again in Louisiana, just like we are in Alberta, but you know, the 5 million tons a year that we are going to be sequestering in the saline aquifers, that's only a portion of the carbon sequestration strategy we have for the region and the area. The project that we're building here, because this also has passed our board of directors and into full execution to be online here by 2026, you know, that justifies the economic investment in building out a world-scale carbon sequestration site for us to think about how to strategically decarbonize other assets on our network for that hydrogen pipeline. Just one more slide and more information kind of on the facility, that this is a 750 million standard cubic feet a day, a SCUF. I hate the term. I hope most people in here don't know what that term is, but I have to say it anyway. What we will be doing there is we'll be placing that hydrogen into our pipeline, so you can actually, through the process of like booking claim, you know, we can be putting low carbon hydrogen into our network. Maybe there are people then associated all the way into Texas from Louisiana that see a value in, you know, working with us on acquiring that low carbon hydrogen across our pipeline network. That is very easy for us to do because that infrastructure already exists. It made sense to co-locate our investment on top of existing infrastructure to show the benefit of just a further build out. But then we also have the capability for blue ammonia transport. Ammonia and hydrogen are sometimes used interchangeably, but ammonia is just a nice way to transport hydrogen as a hydrogen carrier. There are applications for ammonia emerging as a fuel. There's a lot of ocean-going vessels that are actually considering converting over to ammonia engines. All of that is possible from this facility because we're doing the CO2 capture and because we are doing the full-scale carbon sequestration site, again, starting off at like the 5 million ton a year range. I made it all the way to this slide before. I'm just going to hold. All right. So then if you look at across our pipeline network, what's also really important to us is we see kind of a world in which there's green hydrogen, we see blue hydrogen, and then we also see gray hydrogen right now existing, right? For us, there's no reason why hydrogen can't be something like octane at a gasoline pump long term, where you have a benefit for having a lower carbon number associated with your hydrogen production, and that's what we'll be doing across the Gulf Coast. We have the ability to build a larger sequestration site out in Louisiana. That's part of the deal that we did with the Department of Natural Resources. And then fortunately for us, we're strategically looking at different assets that we can decarbonize. So we will be working towards decarbonizing our hydrogen pipeline network. Whereas whenever we did the work with Port Arthur, Texas, that was about a 10% reduction in the carbon intensity for our hydrogen. We now have the capability and plans to go out to about a 30% decarbonized network, which is world scale, and that's something that we really think differentiates us that no one else is really doing today. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, we have lots of time for question and answer. People are feeling antsy, though. Feel free to stand up. It's okay. You don't have to sit down. This is not like class. So anyway, I'm just going to give a little recap. This has been a fascinating panel. We've had lots of different speakers talking about different subjects, ranging everything from very business case centric to far out technology, at least for me, and everything in between. So I would just encourage folks to be thinking about these subjects as you're formulating questions. Cindy started us off talking about the San Juan generating facility, capture on coal-fired power. This is in many ways going back to, all the way back to the roots that DOE's been working on since the last millennium. And she mentioned ESG, she mentioned water, carbon capture as a service. These are all themes that she talked about. Talked about the importance of, pipelines, the Cortez pipeline, maintaining the middle class for the Navajo Nation. Then we had Karen. She was talking about, you have a very diverse company with many different types of energy. They're interested in carbon capture as one of them, specifically in the Appalachian region. She talked about Ohio and Pennsylvania possibly seeking primacy, legacy wells, the impact of shutting down a facility that's already operating on jobs, communities. Then we went back to grad school with Dr. Andrews. He was talking about feed studies, mass transfer, absorbers, all of these things that made me a little nervous, frothing, different things. So, a lot of folks have technology questions. He's your guy. And then Matt talking about kind of the future of hydrogen and thinking about beyond SMR technology and very fascinating subjects there, moving down into the Gulf. So does anybody have any questions? I'm just going to stand up here because I can't, from my sitting vantage point, I cannot see this side of the room. And I will just pass the microphone down to whomever, and then they can pass around the microphone. So if anybody has any questions right off the bat, please just raise your hand. And Emma, I think, has a microphone as well, too. So don't be shy. Oh, nobody yet. Okay, well, I'm curious to know, so, oh, we do have it.
Yeah, you can't see me because you're getting blind.
There we go, Matt.
Yeah, so I'm the other Matt. I had a question. So if there were one silver, this is for the project proponents on the panel, if there were one silver bullet, be it a policy, a regulation, a law, or potentially a financial incentive that could put your proposed project or technology over the hump into economy-wide deployment like tomorrow, what would that be?
I can take part of that.
Great, Karen.
Carbon tax.
So what we're doing right now is we're building proponents for a hub in Appalachia, is meeting with all aspects of the supply chain and the consumer chain, and I think really the hydrogen end users need to be incentivized because right now it's cheaper for them in a power plant, for example, to run natural gas. And so really there needs to be some sort of incentives. As I said earlier, we really need a public-private partnership to really make this work. And I think right now, you really need that incentive to get the hydrogen end users, the steel mills, the power plants, that they can afford to look at these technologies.
Two mics, double mic, but I guess I'd say for us too at our products, since we're past final investment decision on all these complexes, so these are actually in execution, the way that we have viewed it actually is, again, on the incentivization of like the hydrogen end markets, but we have found that the market actually is developing nicely for people that see a benefit in locking up like a premium product, which is like low carbon hydrogen. And so from our perspective, we've kind of done, there's the chicken and the egg. Will you have the end users and the demand come online? We absolutely are in support of figuring that out from a hydrogen economy development standpoint, but we've decided to just put the product out there first, and that's kind of a differentiating factor. So we've been really supported by our board of directors in making a lot of low carbon clean hydrogen for the market, and then people have seen kind of a benefit in since it'll be there in 2025, kind of being the first to come to the table.
And being the little one at the table as a startup, I would say that pore space, clarity around pore space ownership across the board is important, not just for our current project, but I would say it's important for us to reach large-scale deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. So that means it's got to be done by the states, it's got to be done at the federal level. Obviously, there is work being done at a federal level, and we're waiting for that bill to come through or to get see the light of day. But so I'd say pore space is huge, and then clearly as a small startup developer, I also think the tax credit duration. I personally believe if you add more years to the tax credit window, right, where your collection window, I actually think that's a bigger economic game changer than necessarily adding more, increasing the value of the tax credit. And that I only view that because of the large scale. I believe that increasing the value of the tax credit is going to be required to get much broader carbon capture deployment, especially on smaller facilities.
Great, thank you for that. Other questions? We have a couple in the middle here, I see.
Hi, I'm Reg Manhas from Lapis Energy. Question for Matt and Karen, I guess. Lapis is working here in the United States, Louisiana, Arkansas, et cetera, but I'm originally from Canada, so from Alberta. So I'm really interested, Matt, in your perspective in terms of how would you compare the commercial frameworks and the regulatory frameworks between your project in Alberta, I presume that's Fort Saskatchewan, versus what you're doing in Louisiana in terms of what's the financial framework that you're working in within Alberta, and from a regulatory standpoint, how would you compare the EPA Class 6 process with what you're seeing in Canada, I guess, with the Alberta environment folks? And Karen, same thing for you in terms of Northern Lights. What's Equinor's experience overseas, and how is that translating to how you're trying to get things moving forward in Appalachia?
No, great. So I'll say there's a lot of similarities with our projects in the hydrogen distribution model between the two projects in Alberta and Louisiana. So they both have a hydrogen pipeline that exists, for instance. That's really important to us because those are existing customers that have the ability to offload or offtake hydrogen kind of into their energy mix. So actually decarbonizing that network for people that already are using hydrogen, really important. So from that standpoint, that part of the projects are pretty similar. From a regulatory standpoint, I would say, in Canada, there is a federal incentive that has already been passed and ramping up by the end of the decade. I think the $200 Canadian, this is being recorded, so you don't want to make that mistake, but I think it's at like the end of the decade at 2030. That doesn't exist in the US, right? So in Louisiana, the benefit for us especially is access to global markets, right? So we have ammonia, we can distribute it along the Mississippi River. In Alberta, we don't have that, so it's really important to co-locate our facility along the hydrogen pipeline to get to existing customers, and there's more of a driver there because of the fact that there's a federal tax coming at $200 a ton, which is equivalent to the LCFS in California, right? So that both of those two factors kind of made us, from I'll say an ammonia exporting model or a localized source for offtake for hydrogen. The carbon sequestration side, because it was a good question, a lot of layers to it, right? So from a technology standpoint, and like the actual different like stratigraphic layers, like the Miocene, and then I'll stop there because there's a lot of geologists in the room, and that's the extent of what I can say. I can say Oligocene too, but Miocene is where I focus. That technology is the same, right? Like carbon sequestration, 40 million tons or whatever have been sequestered successfully over 40 years without incident like that. That's kind of the same. And then within Alberta, I think the crown actually is the one that manages the carbon sequestration side. So that's why we have like kind of a consortium approach in Alberta versus in Louisiana being able to work directly with the Department of Natural Resources and kind of negotiate an operating agreement. That's why we went kind of, obviously on our own, working to, potentially work with like primacy with Louisiana on that standpoint.
Yeah, and in terms of the difference between Norway and Appalachia, obviously earlier I said Norway's had a carbon tax since 1991, which really accelerated carbon capture and sequestration, also the ability to pipe it offshore, which we won't have obviously in Appalachia. There's just a number of more incentives. Obviously Europe has embraced sort of low carbon, zero carbon future more than in the US. And as I try to explain to my colleagues who aren't from the US, politics tie up everything, and we have an election cycle every 2 years, and so even to get past, you saw the Build Back Better bill had some incentives there that got caught up in some other, into politics. So I guess, there's just a lot more incentives in Europe, carrots and sticks. So.
Great, and then another question here.
Thank you. My name is David Elam at TRC, and this question is really for Matt. I was wondering if you could go back and maybe give a little bit more explanation between the difference between steam methane reforming and autothermal reforming, and then what the difference between the carbon capture technologies might be associated with those two. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. And sorry, I'm shielding my eye. I wasn't trying to dodge the question. So steam methane reforming, the typical way to make hydrogen historically, it's the most efficient way to make the best ratio of hydrogen because there's multiple byproducts in the reaction. You make carbon monoxide. There's shift reactions that go on. Steam methane reforming produces the highest amount of hydrogen for your feedstock. What the issue of steam methane reforming is, though, is it needs like direct fired heaters because as a result of the way that the reaction takes place, you have to have natural gas as your feed, and also you have to have natural gas kind of go into a thermos. A furnace, not a thermos. And at that point in time, that natural gas going out the flue stack, that's the low dilute CO2, right? That has, because air is 79% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, that CO2 is at atmospheric conditions, so hard to compress and capture it typically because that CO2 is dilute, but it's also, very costly and expensive to do that. The hydrogen production technologies for air products in the future, one called an autothermal reaction, so meaning it maintains its own reaction temperature, and the CO2 process emissions, they don't come out of a flue stack because the reaction is done at pressure and at a temperature. The CO2 comes with the hydrogen product. So it's at a more concentrated but also at a higher pressure, so it's easier to separate. There's another technology that we're doing in Louisiana. It's actually called the partial oxidation technology, so you're partially oxidizing the natural gas. Again, that is actually at pressure and at temperature, and you don't have these dilute flue gas emissions that are very hard to concentrate up to actually separate. And we use vacuum swing adsorption technologies across the board for the benefit of using electricity long term. That's going to be easier to decarbonize than like a steam for a liquid solvent regeneration process.
Great. Any other questions? One over there. I'm just going to slip a question in here to Dr. Andrews because I want to make sure he gets an opportunity to talk. Doctor, you talked about a lot of your research projects at University of Kentucky are feed study level, lower TRL levels. I'm curious to know sort of if you could go through the technology transfer process of how this ends up making it to a commercial scale project, if you just want to enlighten the room, how that works and your interactions with the DOE,
Sure.
That would be great.
Well, the TRL levels for these changes, I had that little graph going up. You're pushing into 5, 6 on a lot of these projects as you're doing demonstrations on active plants, like we did at Brown Station, like they're going to be doing at Nucor. But part of that in terms of technology transfer and ties directly to also sort of DOE expectations, is that you don't do any of this without an industry partner. And so the most direct way is those partners are involved because either they want to integrate one of their technologies, and so they're motivated to have it tied up within the project, or they're interested in the outcome. And so that's the most likely, commercialization step is, as you develop your partnership, you also are developing people who are technology providers and who would want to take that technology forward. University's business model is we lose all of our money every year. And so that we don't do this kind of, technology commercialization that way. We do it through partners. And so we try to build those into all of the projects.
I've never heard that.
And then question over here.
He's off.
Panelists, thank you all for all of your information. I know I'm in front of the light here.
No, you're good, you're good.
I want to take a broad development question and pose it to the panel generally. And I'm curious from development partners and also from a technology angle, what the considerations should be for a facility considering a carbon management project. Matt, Hagen, you touched on that in your presentation. You mentioned what are those specific assets. And I think all the panelists kind of hit on that. But I'd like to pose that question generally to the panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, could you just repeat the question one more time?
Technology and development partners considerations.
Right.
Carbon management projects. Cindy, you talked a lot about the infrastructure, right? You've got a whole line right across from the facilities. You're on a bunch of infrastructure, transportation lines, things like that. I think all of you kind of touched on it, but I'm curious broadly from the panel.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. For Enchant as a startup company, as a developer, and frankly for me personally, as I looked at the opportunity, technology and partnerships basically were critical. Choosing Mitsubishi because of its commercialization of its technology on a power plant was, we're not we're not taking huge technology risk. I'd say the other aspect of that is Mitsubishi is providing a 95% capture performance guarantee. So very important when we're going to the market for financing, especially also with tax equity investors, right? Those are critical because of technological risk. Partners in general was very important to me because of the names they'd selected. I already knew. I knew Kiewit Power Constructors from my 30 years in the industry. Happened to have a little bit of a tie with Berkshire as well there, and also Sargent Lundy because they knew this power plant inside out. They'd done a ton of work at that power facility. I also had done a lot of work with Sargent Lundy at our facilities at Pacific Corp over the years. So, and the fact that they all three were involved in the Petronova project, which was the project that proved the Mitsubishi technology at scale, was very big for me. Beyond that, it became the rest of the partnerships. And I think as a startup company, you're only as good as your partners, in my personal opinion, and you need to go after the best.
That's a great question. And can you hear me? That's a great question, and we're doing that now. My company's doing that exercise as we put together a consortium of not just companies, but also community partners. It's going to be very important for the Biden administration with this hub financing that we hit the environmental justice standpoint. So we're working with communities, with universities, institutions, in terms of universities, in terms of research. A company like mine brings experience doing carbon capture and hydrogen. A lot of companies, haven't had that experience at that kind of large scale, so that we'll have a lot of things that we can teach. other groups, but we also need, for example, big suppliers of natural gas. So we're working with the suppliers of natural gas to make the hydrogen, and we're working with a lot of the industrial partners. And what has been interesting as we're doing this is the amount of companies that have come forward that we might not have even thought of. You're just going to aggregate little small businesses that want to be part of this because they have, they want to deal with their carbon, right? So it's been quite interesting to see that the whole sort of takes a village. So it's going to be quite a broad base of entities, I think, that will be on those FOA applications for financing and making the hub.
I'll interject one thing just from a university perspective, that when you're doing these development projects, one of the roles that we often play is working on workforce development. That may be working with the community or technical college system to do sort of fundamental engineering tech type programs where you can get pre-qualified workforce, or it may be up through like the University of Kentucky, where our engineering program does look at partnerships with industry in terms of making sure we're tailoring part of the curriculum to match with where is it going and what are the jobs of the future.
Yeah, other than the discussion earlier was for us around like co-locating our plants close to carbon sequestration, close to our product, because we, like for Air Products, carbon capture and sequestration is really a business enabler. It's not like our full business model, so it's important for us to really have control of that whole value chain to make clean hydrogen. That's really important to us, but the industrial facilities and co-locating sequestration along our existing assets, like that prolongs the life of those facilities. On top of the fact that it really, the industry probably, and everyone in this room, and I think actually Cindy had a mention of it in one of her slides, we should do a better job of talking about when you capture CO2, you don't selectively just capture CO2. You're also removing the nitrous oxides, the sulfur oxides, and that's a local emission abatement that is really beneficial from an environmental justice standpoint. So that's really important to us as well, to be able to retrofit assets at the same time that you're bringing new plants into development, because you can maybe financially justify this as a public company on the new plant. You can retrofit those existing assets and really clean up the localized air emissions. That's also really important.
Well, great. I do not want to interfere with the three most beautiful words in the English language, which are time for lunch. But I think we have one more question, and so we will finish questions with you.
To stand between lunch, this last part of the session, but I wanted to kind of continue this last bit of dialogue and maybe also ask a slightly two-parter question, and specifically for Dr. Andrews, like thinking of, you mentioned addressing secondary like emission contributors like SOx and NOx and particulate matters, and I was wondering maybe from a technological standpoint if you could say a little bit about how innovative solutions can tackle both carbon capture and those secondary emissions. And then for the rest of the panel, I was wondering if you can kind of explicitly address what additional kind of benefits can come from these solutions, especially for these additional emissions that come from particulate matter or from SOx or NOx associated with energy generation or chemical products or packaging.
Okay, I'm going to give a very boring answer to that, which is that for most of the carbon capture technologies, you're going to have to do SOx, NOx, and particulate knockdown before you go into a capture system. You'll stuff the absorber column. You'll do things like precipitate out all of your stuff as a salt. So rather than it being it's necessarily a technology that really does something novel with that, if you're going to do these technologies, you have to already do those things as part of that. And so that does force adoption of technologies that for abatement of those emissions. Now, there are newer technologies that can be employed for doing that. One of the advantages, for example, of looking at algae systems, particularly for small-scale applications, are that they're very tolerant of sulfur, and actually are quite tolerant of sulfuric acid, dilute. And so they will actually use that as part of the biomass. The problem is then you have the sulfur in the biomass. But there are different ways to do that. Matt mentioned autothermal reforming. In many ways, it's the same way. You need to particularly capture sulfur before you go into shift reactions, or your catalyst will last about 10 minutes, and they're very expensive. So that it's more about, it just requires these technologies to be employed. Did you want somebody else can?
No, yeah, go ahead. Same as my last answer. I guess it was great that you're not just sequestering CO2, right? So you're also having a very good localized emissions cleanup for like the NOx, the SOx, like that's localized potential for acid rain, things like that that also are a side benefit.
Yeah, and in terms of something that we're doing as a company, but I think a lot of companies are doing it, is responsibly produce natural gas. So even the natural gas that goes into the hydrogen, we talked about the different colors of hydrogen, and we actually like to get away from the colors and look at the life cycle analysis, because not all natural gas is created equal. As it happens, natural gas that we're producing in the Marcellus and have a very low ratio. So there are different kinds of ways that we can do it even before we get to the hydrogen, producing the hydrogen. A lot of things that we can do. A lot of things we can do to. I think the industry is getting a lot better at fugitive methane emissions and working on controlling that from that standpoint.
Yeah, and I would just add that is the exact reason why the projects that we're looking for in our pipeline already have low emissions. They've already, come through the process of, their scrubbers, low NOx burners, mercury controls, everything, and they're now ready for carbon abatement because you really need all of that done first. And so if you are a power generation station and you haven't put either SNCR on or SCR on, you're looking at the potentials of having to add those to your project. And it just adds cost and cost. But the great thing about the actual carbon capture technologies is they remove additional, right? So you're not, you're not zero on SO2. Right? You're significantly mitigated because of the controls before you do your carbon capture. And the carbon capture process itself is not just removing carbon, but it's also in the instance of the amine-based technology that Mitsubishi has for their solvent. It's removing 50% of whatever's left for SO2, 50% of whatever's left of SO3. So you are getting that incremental benefit, but you do need to have the mitigation done first.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a fascinating panel. Let's give them all a round of hand of applause. And I think it's time for lunch. Matt, do you have any other announcements?
So I will take just 1 second to hold everybody up from lunch. We need to acknowledge a few folks before we head out to eat this afternoon. I could not do this. I don't have the physical or mental capability to put together a program like that. So we need to thank the folks that did this. Jill and Emma worked over the last several months tirelessly to put things together. So we all have chairs to sit in and a place to sleep and food to eat and things to drink. So appreciate everything they've done, as well as Grace, who's in our industrial innovation team, has come down with us today to help, or for the next 2 days, to help facilitate and make sure the program runs smoothly. So before everybody goes and eats, let's give them a round of applause and thank them. Enjoy your lunch.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.